Okay, so get this. One of our sources is claiming that China wants to get rid of the United States.
Wow.
I know, right? Sounds a little
Yeah,
dramatic.
like a movie plot or something.
Exactly. It's from this article on CBN News. It's about China's growing global influence and how some experts are seeing it as a direct challenge to the U.S. We're going to unpack all of that today and see what's really going on, but buckle up. This is
Awesome.
going to be a wild ride. So, you've probably noticed that China's presence is kind of everywhere these days, right?
Yeah, definitely.
But in this deep dive, we're going to focus specifically on their control over shipping ports and the Belt and Road Initiative. These are like the two key pillars of their global strategy.
It's not about armies and invasions anymore. It's a much more subtle power play.
Right. It's about controlling the flow of goods and resources. And this article claims it all starts with ports. You know those massive cargo ships that move everything around the world?
Yeah.
Apparently, China already controls 7 of the world's 10 largest shipping ports.
7.
7 out of 10.
Wow. That's a lot.
Yeah. It's a huge amount of control. And it's not just about the number of ports they control, it's about where those ports are located.
Exactly. The location is key. They've invested billions upon billions of dollars in building or acquiring stakes in 129 ports across 50 countries.
129 ports. That's insane.
It is. And these aren't just random locations. They're strategically placed along crucial shipping routes.
So they're thinking long term, planning for the future.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like they're playing a giant game of Risk, positioning themselves to control the world's trade routes.
That's a great analogy. So it's about more than just the number of ports. It's about location, location, location.
Exactly. Imagine the world's shipping lanes like a giant highway system, and China is buying up all the most important intersections.
That's kind of scary when you think about it.
It is a little unsettling. To really grasp the implications, let's zoom in on one example, the Chansay megaport in Peru.
Okay. What's so special about this particular port?
Well, for starters, it's brand new, built with a nearly $4 billion investment from China.
$4 billion.
Yeah. And that investment gives them a 60% controlling stake in the port.
Wow. So they basically own it.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And this port is going to reshape trade between China and South America. It's expected to cut shipping time by 10 days.
10 days. That's a lot.
It is. It means lower costs and faster delivery times for goods coming from China, which makes them more competitive in the global market.
So they're playing the long game here, setting themselves up for economic dominance.
Yes, but it goes deeper than just saving a few days on shipping. Retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, he's quoted in this article, uses the word access. These ports provide China with access to resources, access to potentially displace the U.S. in key markets, and even access that could be leveraged for military purposes in the future.
Wait, hold on. Access for military purposes? You're saying a commercial port could potentially become a military base?
It's a concern that many experts have raised. A port designed for cargo ships today could potentially accommodate warships tomorrow. It's a subtle but significant shift in the balance of power.
That's definitely unsettling. It's almost like a Trojan horse scenario, right? They come in with economic benefits and then bang, military influence.
Yeah, it's a possibility that we need to be aware of. And there's another layer to this that's even more concerning. Many of these ports, especially those operated by the Chinese company COSCO Shipping, use a software system called Loginc to manage their operations.
Logging? What's that?
It's a logistics platform that tracks the movement of goods in real time. The problem is, it's owned by the Chinese government.
Hold on, so you're saying China could potentially be tracking not just their own shipments, but the movements of goods and ships all over the world? That sounds like something out of a spy movie.
It does raise some serious questions about data security and potential misuse of information. If they have access to that kind of data, they could gain a significant strategic advantage.
Right, they could see everything. Global trade patterns, vulnerabilities, even the movements of military vessels.
Exactly. It's a pretty powerful tool. So we've got a network of strategically placed ports, some potentially vulnerable to future military use, and a software system that might be giving China a global view of shipping activity. It all paints a pretty intense picture of their ambitions.
Yeah, it does. And it makes you wonder what they're going to do with all that power.
Exactly. But ports are just one piece of the puzzle. They've also launched this massive project called the Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to connect Asia, Europe, and Africa through a vast network of infrastructure projects.
Yeah, the Belt and Road Initiative, I've heard that name before, but honestly, I'm a little fuzzy on the details. What exactly are they building?
Well, think of it this way. They're building roads, railways, pipelines, power grids, fiber optic cables, basically all the infrastructure needed to facilitate trade and communication on a massive scale.
Sounds pretty ambitious.
Oh, it is. It's huge EE. We're talking about trillions of dollars in investment.
Trillions. Wow. So what's the goal here? What are they trying to achieve with all this infrastructure?
Well, China has poured over $1 trillion into the Belt and Road Initiative. And get this, a staggering $800 billion of that has been invested in Africa alone between 2013 and 2023.
$800 billion in Africa. That's mind-boggling.
It is, and it shows how serious they are about expanding their influence in the developing world. They're basically reshaping the economic landscape of entire continents.
Okay, so we've got ports, we've got infrastructure, but what's the end game here? What are they ultimately trying to achieve?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that experts are still trying to figure out. But according to Gordon Chang, an expert from the Gatestone Institute quoted in this article, China sees the United States as an existential threat.
An existential threat? Wow. Why would they view us that way? I mean, we're not exactly at war with them, are we?
No, not in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
But Chang argues that China feels threatened by the influence of American values like democracy and individual freedom. They believe these values could undermine their own system and their pursuit of global power.
So it's not just an economic competition, it's ideological too.
It seems that way. And the article goes even further, claiming that China wants to get rid of the United States in order to ensure its own security.
Get rid of the United States. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is, and it's important to note that this is just one perspective. But it does highlight the level of concern that some experts have about China's intentions. Chang argues that the port strategy and the Belt and Road Initiative are all part of a plan to achieve global dominance without resorting to direct military conflict.
So they're playing the long game, using economics and infrastructure to gain power and influence.
Exactly. It's a much more subtle approach than traditional warfare, but it could be just as effective in the long run.
That's a pretty sobering thought. And it makes you wonder how the U.S. is responding to all of this. But before we get into that, I think it's important to understand exactly what China is doing in these other countries, especially with the Belt and Road Initiative. What are some specific examples of their projects?
Well, take Sri Lanka, for example. They built a massive port and airport there. But the project ended up saddling the country with so much debt that they had to lease the port back to China for 99 years.
Whoa. So these investments aren't always as beneficial as they seem.
That's a major concern. Critics argue that China is engaging in debt trap diplomacy, where they intentionally lend money to countries knowing they won't be able to repay, thereby gaining leverage and control over strategically important assets.
So it's not just about building infrastructure, it's about gaining influence and power.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand the potential downsides of these investments, not just the economic benefits they promise.
It's like they're using their economic power to create dependencies.
Right. And those dependencies can be leveraged for political gain down the line.
That's a really important point. I mean, from a developing country's perspective, the promise of new roads, bridges, and ports might sound incredibly appealing. But it's crucial to consider the long-term implications and potential risks associated with these kinds of deals.
Absolutely. It's about weighing the short-term benefits against the long-term consequences. And that's a complex calculation that requires careful consideration and analysis.
Okay, so China's playing a long game, investing heavily in strategic infrastructure projects, and potentially using these investments to gain leverage and influence. It all sounds very deliberate and calculated. But before we get into how the U.S. might be responding to this, I think it's time to shift gears a bit and talk about
how this impacts you more directly.
Yes, I was just about to say that. Let's connect this back to our listeners' everyday life. All of this big picture geopolitical stuff, how does it actually affect them?
Well, think about it this way. All those things, you buy your clothes, your phone, even that coffee you drink this morning.
Yeah.
Chances are, a lot of that stuff came through one of those ports we were just talking about.
Oh, wow. You're right. I didn't even think about it like that.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy when you realize how much of our daily lives is connected to global trade.
So what you're saying is that China's control over these ports could actually affect the prices we pay for things here at home.
It's definitely a possibility. They have a lot of leverage now. And it's not just about what's on store shelves today. The Belt and Road Initiative is about creating new markets for Chinese goods and services.
Right, so they're not just controlling the existing supply chain, they're also creating new demand for their products.
Exactly. They're playing the long game, thinking decades ahead.
So what can the U.S. do about all of this? We can't just sit back and watch them take over, can we?
Well, the article points out that the U.S. is already lagging behind in terms of global investment and influence. For example, China has actually surpassed the U.S. as the largest trading partner in many parts of the world.
Really?
Yeah, even in places like Brazil, which used to be a key U.S. ally.
Wow. That's pretty alarming. If we're losing our allies to China, that's a big problem.
It is. Brad Bowman from the Foundation for Defensive Democracies, he's quoted in the article, says that the U.S. is getting out-hustled by China.
Out-hustled, that's not a good look.
No, it's not. It makes you wonder what we should be doing differently.
Right. Should we be trying to build our own ports and launch competing infrastructure projects? Or is it too late for that?
Well, simply mimicking China's approach might not be the best strategy. Some experts argue that the U.S. needs to offer a more compelling alternative, one that's based on principles of transparency, fair trade, and respect for human rights.
Yeah, that sounds good in theory, but will it be enough to convince countries that are looking for quick and easy development?
That's the challenge. China is offering quick solutions, even if they come with strings attached.
It's like they're offering a deal that's hard to refuse.
Exactly. And the U.S. needs to find a way to compete without compromising its values or repeating the mistakes of the past.
It's a tough balancing act. This whole conversation has been really eye-opening, but it's also pretty intense. It's kind of overwhelming to think about all the implications of China's global strategy. What do you think is the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think the key is to recognize that the world is changing. We're seeing a shift in the balance of power, and it's happening right before our eyes. It's not necessarily about predicting who will win or lose, but about understanding the complexities of this new landscape and adapting to it.
I like that. It's not about panicking. It's about being aware and informed so we can make smart choices about our own future. But honestly, hearing all of this makes me even more curious about China's perspective on all of this. I mean, we've heard a lot from American experts, but what do everyday Chinese people think about their country's ambitions?
That's a great question. It would be fascinating to get their take on all of this. Unfortunately, our stack for today's deep dive focuses solely on American analysis.
Oh, that's too bad. Maybe we can explore that in a future episode. For now, let's try to synthesize what we've learned today. If you had to sum up China's global strategy in one sentence, what would it be?
That's a tough one. But I think it boils down to this. They're playing a strategic long game, leveraging their economic might to expand their influence and reshape the global order.
That's a pretty good summation. And it definitely leaves us with a lot to think about. But before we get too deep into those thoughts, I have one more question that's been nagging at me. Is there any chance that China's plan could backfire?
It's definitely possible. Their aggressive approach has already created some pushback, even from countries that have benefited from their investments. There are concerns about debt traps, environmental damage, and the erosion of local industries.
So it's not a guaranteed win for China.
Not at all. There are a lot of factors that could influence the outcome of this global power struggle, and it's important to remember that the future is never predetermined.
Okay, that's a bit reassuring. I was starting to feel like we were headed for an inevitable showdown. But if the future is still unwritten, that means we have a role to play in shaping it right.
Absolutely. Understanding the challenges and opportunities is the first step.
Right. And on that note of empowerment, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, we want to leave you, dear listener, with a thought-provoking question to ponder. What do you think the U.S. should be doing in response to China's ambitions? Should we be trying to contain them, cooperate with them, or is there a different path altogether?
Yeah, that's the question everyone's asking. And there are no easy answers. But it's definitely a conversation we need to be having.
For sure. So what are some of the options that are being considered?
Well, some people are pushing for a more confrontational approach.
Okay. What would that look like?
Things like economic sanctions, military buildups, and diplomatic pressure. Basically trying to contain China's rise. But other experts are saying that that could actually backfire, lead to a new Cold War or even escalate into a direct conflict.
So maybe not the best strategy. What about the opposite? Is there any room for cooperation with China?
Well, there are definitely areas where our interests align, like climate change, global health, and nuclear nonproliferation.
Right. Those are global issues that affect everyone.
Exactly. And working together on those things could benefit both countries and the world as a whole. But it's tricky, finding that balance between competition and cooperation.
Yeah, it sounds like a delicate dance.
It is. Some experts are calling for what they call strategic competition.
Strategic competition, what does that mean?
It basically means acknowledging that we're in a rivalry with China, but competing in a way that avoids unnecessary escalation or conflict.
So like competing responsibly.
Exactly.
Hmm.
It would involve investing in our own strengths, strengthening our alliances, and pushing back against China's unfair trade practices.
Okay. But at the same time, still leaving room for cooperation on those issues where our interests align.
Right. It's a nuanced approach,
Yeah.
but it's probably the most realistic and sustainable one in the long run.
This has been such a fascinating conversation. It's clear that the U.S.-China relationship is one of the most important and complex issues facing the world today, and there are no easy answers.
Yeah,
But at least now we have a better understanding of the dynamics at play.
I agree. And it's not just about governments and policymakers either.
What do you mean?
I mean, this is something that affects all of us. Every single person listening. The choices we make as consumers, the information we consume, the conversations we have, all of that contributes to the broader narrative.
So you're saying that we all have a role to play in shaping this relationship.
Absolutely. And that's actually a really empowering thought. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of these global issues.
Yeah, for sure. Sometimes it feels like there's nothing we can do as individuals.
That's not true. Change starts at the individual level, with each and every one of us.
That's a good point. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
Keep learning. Keep exploring. Read more about China's Belt and Road Initiative. Learn about the perspectives of people in different countries. Think critically about the choices you make in your own life.
Because the future is still being written.
Exactly. And we all have a part in shaping it.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the future of U.S.-China relations. Until next time, keep diving deep.